Imagine surviving a battle only to discover that survival itself has become your punishment. Imagine standing in chains, surrounded by thousands of men just like you, knowing that whatever is about to happen will not kill you quickly, but will change what it means to be alive forever. This is not a story about defeat alone. This is a story about what happens when power decides that death is too merciful. In the early 11th century, the Byzantine Empire stood as one of the most sophisticated and ruthless powers on earth. It called itself the Roman Empire. It saw itself as chosen, civilized, ordained by God. And at its head stood an emperor who believed order was worth any cost. His name was Basil II. History would later remember him by a title that tells you everything you need to know. Basil the Bulgar-Slayer. Before we go any further, if you want more stories that strip away the polished myths of empires and expose the brutal psychology beneath them, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the History Veil, and share it with someone who believes history is written only by heroes. What you are about to hear is not comfortable, but it is important. To understand what happened to the Bulgarian prisoners, you first need to understand the war that created them. For decades, the Byzantine Empire and the Bulgarian state were locked in a grinding struggle for dominance in the Balkans. This was not a war of quick victories. It was a slow, exhausting conflict fueled by pride, revenge, and survival. Villages burned. Borders shifted. Armies marched, retreated, and marched again. Both sides learned to hate not just the enemy, but the idea of surrender itself. The Bulgarians were not weak. Under Tsar Samuel, they fought with determination and intelligence. They knew the terrain. They used ambushes, fortifications, and attrition. For years, they frustrated the Byzantines, humiliating imperial generals and forcing Basil II to confront a reality he despised. His empire was not invincible. That humiliation changed him. Basil II was not a charismatic ruler. He did not rule through charm or generosity. He ruled through discipline, control, and fear. He believed that order was fragile and that mercy weakened authority. Every defeat hardened him. Every loss convinced him that hesitation was dangerous. Over time, his war against Bulgaria became personal. This was no longer about borders. It was about breaking resistance completely. In the year 1014, the conflict reached its turning point. The Bulgarian army took up defensive positions near the Clydian Pass, a narrow mountain route designed to stop the Byzantine advance. Wooden fortifications blocked the way. The terrain favored the defenders. For days, the Byzantines struggled to break through. Losses mounted. Frustration grew. Then Basil adapted. Byzantine forces found a way around the Bulgarian defenses, attacking from the rear while the main army pressed forward. Caught between two forces, the Bulgarian army collapsed. What followed was not just a defeat. It was a catastrophe. Thousands of Bulgarian soldiers were captured. Estimates vary, but the number that echoes through history is chilling. Around 15,000 men. In most wars, this is the moment where negotiations begin. Prisoners are ransomed, executed, enslaved, exchanged. History is full of such outcomes. What Basil II chose instead was something else entirely. He ordered that the prisoners be blinded. Not killed. Blinded. But even that word does not fully capture what happened. Basil ordered that the men be divided into groups of 100. 99 in each group would have both eyes destroyed. The 100th man would be left with one eye. Just enough vision to lead the others home. This was not chaos. It was organization. It was procedure. It was a calculated act designed to send a message far beyond the battlefield. The Byzantines did not simply want to win. They wanted to demonstrate what resistance would cost. Imagine the psychology of that order. Imagine what it takes to decide that death is insufficient. That suffering must continue long after the battle ends. Basil understood something terrifying about power. Fear that lingers is more effective than fear that ends. The act itself was methodical. Soldiers or officials carried it out group by group. The prisoners could hear what was happening before it reached them. Screams did not need explanation. The waiting was part of the punishment. Survival became something to dread. For the men who were left with one eye, the cruelty was different but no less severe. They were burdened with responsibility. They had to guide their blinded comrades across rough terrain, through forests and mountains, back toward Bulgaria. Every step was slow. Every stumble was agony. Hunger, infection, exhaustion followed them. Many likely died along the way. But enough survived to complete the journey. When they finally reached Tsar Samuel and the Bulgarian heartland, the effect was immediate and devastating. Contemporary sources claim that Samuel collapsed upon seeing them. According to some accounts, he suffered a stroke and died shortly afterward. Whether that detail is literal or symbolic, the meaning is clear. Basil's message was received. Resistance did not end instantly. But something fundamental broke. The war dragged on for a few more years, but the psychological damage was irreversible. In 1018, Bulgaria was fully absorbed into the Byzantine Empire. Basil had achieved what decades of fighting had failed to do. He had crushed the will to resist. This is why Basil II was not remembered simply as a conqueror. He was remembered as a warning. His nickname was not an accident. It was a reputation he cultivated deliberately. What makes this story especially disturbing is not just the brutality, but the logic behind it. Basil did not act out of uncontrolled rage. He acted with intent. He believed that by inflicting unforgettable suffering on a specific group, he could save lives in the long term by discouraging future rebellion. This is the mindset of empire at its coldest. Violence framed as stability. Cruelty justified as necessity. And this raises an uncomfortable question. Was this act uniquely monstrous, or was it simply an extreme expression of how empires maintain control? Because once you strip away the language of civilization, faith, and order, what remains is a simple calculation. How much suffering is acceptable to preserve power? This is only the beginning of that calculation. The blinding of the prisoners was not the end of their suffering. In many ways, it was only the beginning. History often freezes this event at the moment of cruelty, as if the act itself contains the whole horror. But the true weight of Basil II's decision unfolded afterward, in silence, distance, and survival without sight. Imagine the journey back to Bulgaria. Thousands of men, most of them now completely blind, forced to move across mountains, forests, and broken roads. They did not travel as an army anymore. They moved as a wound. Each man held onto the shoulder or belt of the one in front of him. Progress was slow, painful, and disorienting. A single misstep could mean falling, injury, or death. Hunger followed them. Infection followed them. Winter air burned their lungs. Many never completed the journey. Those who did carried more than physical damage. They carried memory. The sound of screaming. The waiting. The knowledge that this was not an accident of war, but a decision. A message delivered through their bodies. When the blinded soldiers reached Bulgarian territory, they did not return as warriors. They returned as proof. Villages watched them pass in stunned silence. Families recognized voices before faces. Fathers reached out for sons who could no longer see them. Brothers guided brothers. Children learned what empire meant without needing explanation. Tsar Samuel's reaction became legend. Chroniclers wrote that when he saw the blinded army, his heart failed him. Some say he suffered a stroke and died 2 days later. Whether the timeline is exact matters less than the symbolism. Basil's cruelty had achieved its purpose. It did not just defeat an army. It shattered leadership, morale, and belief in resistance. This is the psychological core of what Basil II understood. Killing removes opposition. Maiming transforms it into a living reminder. Every blinded soldier became a walking warning. Every village became a witness. Fear spread faster than armies ever could. But this raises a disturbing question. How did an empire that saw itself as Christian, civilized, and lawful justify such an act? The Byzantine Empire did not view itself as brutal. It viewed itself as orderly. Basil II believed he was restoring balance. In Byzantine political thought, rebellion was not merely a military act. It was a moral failure. To rebel against the emperor was to rebel against divine order. Punishment, therefore, was not cruelty. It was correction. This mindset allowed extraordinary violence to feel righteous. Blinding, in particular, held symbolic power. In Byzantine culture, blinding was a way to neutralize without killing. A blinded man could not rule, could not fight, could not threaten authority. Death was final, but blinding was permanent submission. It removed agency while preserving life. From the perspective of empire, it was efficient. Basil II applied this logic on a massive scale. What had once been a punishment for political rivals became a weapon of war. The scale shocked even contemporaries. Chroniclers did not hide their horror, but they recorded the event with grim acceptance. Basil's reputation changed forever. He was feared. He was respected. And most importantly, he was obeyed. After 1014, Bulgarian resistance weakened steadily. Fortresses fell. Nobles surrendered. Alliances collapsed. By 1018, Bulgaria was fully absorbed into the Byzantine Empire. Basil had won the longest war of his reign not through mercy, but through memory. The war ended because people believed further resistance would only produce more suffering. From Basil's perspective, this was success. Yet history does not end with emperors. What happened to the blinded men afterward is largely unrecorded. Empires are meticulous about victories and careless about consequences. We do not know how many survived long-term. We do not know how communities supported them, or failed to. We do know that their lives would never return to what they had been. Soldiers trained for combat were forced into dependence. Farmers lost their livelihoods. Families absorbed the burden. Trauma spread quietly through generations. This is the unseen cost of imperial strategy. Violence does not end when the order is carried out. It echoes. Basil II lived for several more years after the conquest of Bulgaria. He ruled with confidence, expanded imperial control, and left behind a treasury overflowing with wealth. He never married. He had no children. When he died in 1025, the empire mourned him as one of its greatest emperors. But something else happened after his death. The empire he left behind began to weaken. Successors lacked his discipline. Internal divisions grew. External pressures mounted. Within decades, Byzantine power entered slow decline. The terror Basil had wielded was effective, but it was personal. It did not create sustainable stability. Fear requires constant renewal. Once the memory fades, resistance returns. This is the paradox of brutality as policy. It works. But only temporarily. The story of the Bulgarian prisoners forces us to confront a truth about history that is deeply uncomfortable. Empires often achieve their greatest successes through acts they later try to forget. They celebrate conquest, order, and civilization, while burying the suffering that made those achievements possible. Basil II is remembered as a great emperor. The blinded men are remembered as a footnote. But history is not just the story of those who issue commands. It is also the story of those who endure them. And in this case, endurance was worse than death. Because the men who survived Basil's mercy carried the empire with them for the rest of their lives. This is not the end of the story. Because the way this event was remembered, justified, and later erased tells us just as much about power as the act itself. And that is where we go next. What happened after the blinding did not disappear into silence. It was transformed into narrative. And narratives are how empires survive their own brutality. Byzantine chroniclers did not describe Basil II as a monster. They described him as necessary. Firm. Just. The act against the Bulgarian prisoners was framed as discipline, not cruelty. Order, not savagery. This distinction mattered deeply, because empires do not operate on violence alone. They operate on belief. People must believe that suffering has purpose. In Byzantine political thought, the emperor was not merely a ruler. He was the guardian of cosmic balance. His authority flowed from God, and rebellion was therefore not just political defiance, but spiritual disorder. When Basil punished the Bulgarians, he was not seen as choosing cruelty. He was restoring harmony. At least, that is how the story was told. This is how extreme violence becomes acceptable. Not through rage, but through explanation. Blinding, in particular, carried symbolic weight in Byzantine culture. A blind man was considered unfit to rule, unfit to fight, unfit to challenge authority. This is why Byzantine emperors often blinded rivals instead of killing them. Death could create martyrs. Maiming created submission. It left the body alive while removing the threat. Basil II understood this tradition intimately. What made his action extraordinary was not the method, but the scale. He took a punishment reserved for elites and applied it to an entire army. In doing so, he transformed tradition into terror. The message was unmistakable. Resistance would not be met with negotiation. It would not even be met with death. It would be met with survival so damaged that it destroyed the desire to ever resist again. And it worked. After 1014, Bulgarian nobles began to defect. Fortresses surrendered without siege. Leaders calculated the cost of resistance and chose submission instead. Fear spread faster than armies ever could. Basil did not need to blind another army. The memory did the work for him. This is the strategic genius and moral horror of what he did. Violence that does not need to be repeated becomes policy. But here is where the story becomes more complex. Because fear is a fragile foundation. The empire that Basil II strengthened through terror did not become more humane. It became quieter. Obedience replaced rebellion, but resentment remained. Submission is not loyalty. It is delay. And once the source of fear disappears, what remains is memory without restraint. Basil ruled until 1025. During his lifetime, the empire remained stable, disciplined, and feared. But after his death, cracks appeared quickly. His successors lacked his authority. His discipline could not be inherited. The fear he generated was personal, not institutional. Within decades, the Byzantine Empire began to lose territory. Internal corruption grew. Military effectiveness declined. The terror that had held the borders collapsed without renewal. This is the weakness of brutality as governance. It requires constant reinforcement. Mercy builds loyalty. Fear builds dependence. The blinded Bulgarians, meanwhile, disappeared from the historical record. We do not know their names. We do not know how many survived long-term. We do not know how they lived, how they were cared for, or how they died. Empires are excellent at documenting victories and terrible at documenting aftermath. What we do know is that communities absorbed them. Families adapted. Fields were left untended. Burdens shifted. Trauma became inheritance. Children grew up understanding what the empire was capable of without ever seeing it directly. This is how violence spreads beyond the moment it occurs. It reshapes behavior, expectation, and identity. It teaches people what is possible, and therefore what must be avoided. From a modern perspective, Basil II's actions appear monstrous. But that judgment, while understandable, risks missing the deeper lesson. Basil was not an anomaly. He was an extreme expression of imperial logic. Empires exist to maintain control. When challenged, they escalate. When escalation works, it becomes precedent. History is filled with moments like this. Not always blinding. Sometimes deportation. Sometimes starvation. Sometimes cultural erasure. The methods change. The calculation remains the same. How much suffering will prevent future resistance? The Byzantine Empire believed it had answered that question in 1014. But history does not end with answers. It continues with consequences. Basil II was buried with honor. His reign was praised. His treasury was full. And yet, the empire he left behind could not sustain itself without him. The terror he wielded solved immediate problems and created long-term fragility. This is the paradox of absolute power. The more it relies on fear, the less resilient it becomes. And this is why the story of the Bulgarian prisoners matters beyond medieval history. It forces us to confront how easily cruelty can be justified when wrapped in language of order, faith, and necessity. It shows us how suffering becomes invisible once it has served its purpose. The men who lost their sight became tools in a calculation they never consented to. Their lives were rewritten to support a narrative of imperial strength. And once that narrative was complete, they were no longer needed. History moved on. But memory did not. Because acts like this leave scars not just on bodies, but on civilizations. They reveal what power is willing to do when it believes it must win at any cost. And they remind us that the difference between civilization and cruelty is often only a matter of explanation. This is not yet the end of the story. Because how later generations remembered Basil II, justified his actions, and debated his legacy tells us just as much about power as the act itself. And that is where we go next. Centuries later, the story of Basil II no longer belonged only to the men he blinded. It belonged to historians, theologians, generals, and empires trying to explain themselves. And how they remembered him tells us something just as important as what he did. Byzantine writers praised Basil as a restorer of order. They admired his discipline, his refusal to indulge in luxury, his relentless focus on stability. His cruelty was not denied. It was reframed. Necessary severity. Just punishment. A ruler willing to do what others could not. In their telling, Basil did not enjoy violence. He endured it for the greater good. This framing mattered. It transformed horror into responsibility. Once cruelty is explained as duty, it becomes teachable, repeatable, portable. Later rulers studied Basil not to imitate his compassion, but his effectiveness. They asked a simple question. Did it work? And for a time, the answer seemed to be yes. This is how violence becomes doctrine. But outside imperial courts and chronicles, memory worked differently. Among the people, Basil's name carried fear long after his armies were gone. Stories passed through generations. Not as dates or titles, but as warnings. Do not provoke the empire. Do not believe mercy will save you. Do not assume surrender guarantees safety. These stories shape behavior more deeply than any law ever could. In Bulgaria, the event became a wound in national memory. It symbolized not just defeat, but humiliation designed to last beyond the battlefield. The men who returned blind were living proof that resistance could cost more than life itself. Their presence reshaped how communities thought about power. Survival was no longer victory. Sometimes it was the punishment. This dual memory reveals something essential about history. The same act can be remembered as justice by the powerful and as terror by the powerless. Neither memory is neutral. Both serve a purpose. Over time, scholars began to debate Basil's legacy more openly. Some argued he was a product of his era. Others insisted that even by medieval standards, his actions were extreme. But these debates often stayed safely academic. They focused on context, comparison, and intent. Rarely did they linger on consequence. Because consequence is harder to contain. The blinding of the Bulgarian prisoners forces us to confront a truth about empire that many prefer to avoid. Empires are not sustained by ideals alone. They are sustained by moments of overwhelming violence that redefine what resistance means. These moments are not accidents. They are calculated. And once they succeed, they become templates. We see echoes of this logic again and again. Punishments designed not just to harm, but to be seen. To travel. To instruct. Deportations. Public executions. Collective reprisals. Cultural erasure. The method changes. The message remains the same. Power must be felt in the body to be believed in the mind. Basil II understood this instinctively. He did not need to blind every enemy. He only needed to blind enough to make the story unavoidable. Memory did the rest. Yet there is a limit to what fear can accomplish. The Byzantine Empire outlived Basil, but it never recovered his level of control. The terror he wielded could not be institutionalized without him. His successors tried to govern without his authority, without his discipline, without his singular focus. The result was instability, internal rivalries, military decline. Fear, once detached from its source, loses coherence. This is the weakness at the heart of brutality-based power. It depends too much on the individual. When that individual disappears, the system falters. Meanwhile, the people who suffered under that power continued to adapt. They remembered. They taught their children caution. They shaped cultures around endurance rather than loyalty. Empires underestimate this kind of memory because it is quiet. It does not revolt immediately. It waits. This is why acts like the blinding of the Bulgarian prisoners are never truly finished. They do not end when the order is carried out. They end generations later, when the societies shaped by them either collapse or transform. History often asks whether Basil II was a great emperor. That question misses the point. Greatness is a measurement invented by those who benefit from power. A more honest question is this. What kind of world does such greatness create? A world where order is maintained through terror may function for a time. But it teaches people that power is something to fear, not trust. That obedience is safer than belief. That silence is survival. These lessons do not disappear when empires fall. They linger. They shape how societies respond to authority long afterward. This is why the story of the Bulgarian prisoners still matters. Not because it is uniquely cruel, but because it is painfully clear. It shows us what happens when efficiency outranks humanity. When suffering is justified by stability. When the state decides that the body is an acceptable message. Basil II believed he was securing peace. In reality, he was demonstrating the cost of resistance so vividly that peace became indistinguishable from submission. And submission, sustained long enough, turns into resentment. Empires often mistake silence for consent. The men who lost their sight did not leave behind monuments or chronicles. They left behind something harder to erase. Memory embedded in culture. A warning carried in stories, behavior, and fear. That memory outlived Basil. It outlived the empire he ruled. And that is the final irony. The act designed to immortalize imperial power became one of the clearest examples of its moral fragility. Because when history remembers Basil II, it does not remember only his victories. It remembers the 15,000 men who were allowed to live, but never truly live again. And that memory asks a question that no empire ever answers comfortably. Was the order you preserved worth the humanity you destroyed?